Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sorry for being late, but I was just trying to solve some technical problems. Happy New Year everyone, I hope you are all well, wherever you are in the world. So to continue with the last subject, as I promised, over the next 5 live streams, I will be talking about different schemas in this kind of broader framework of schema therapy. So as a quick recap, in the last live stream, I kind of explained how we can use the whole framework of schema therapy for personal development, for kind of looking at different things in our lives, in our personalities, in our behaviors, in terms of what we can improve, what we can develop. So the very foundation of that framework is that we need to meet our needs in order to kind of become more adaptable, more flexible, and of course start succeeding in life generally. So in today's video, I'm gonna focus on the need for autonomy and performance. So basically, we all want, or rather need, because it is a need, we want to feel like we can take care of ourselves, we can rely on ourselves, we can trust ourselves, and that, you know, even if things go bad in our life, for example, we can be there for ourselves, that in a way that we don't have to entirely depend on other people, although of course asking for help is not something wrong entirely. Hi everyone, I see some chat coming up. All right, this person goes, just cleaning up things. So autonomy and performance, as I was explaining, relates to this idea of independence, wanting to do things by ourselves. In terms of schema therapy and this idea that we might be having maladaptive schemas, that's what the framework of schema therapy describes and wants to address, is that we might be having some sort of expectations, either towards ourselves or towards other people, that prevent us from meeting this need. So we might feel like maybe we are super dependent on other people, maybe we feel like we are not maybe competent enough or kind of skilled enough to take care of ourselves. So all these little expectations can prevent us from meeting that need for autonomy and performance. So what ends up happening is that we might feel perhaps lost in life or kind of empty, or struggle to define what we want, struggle to define our goals and how to strive towards them. We might procrastinate, we might lack discipline, we might struggle with, things like kind of adult things, basically. I don't know how else to describe it, but basically, I'm thinking about this need as a kind of foundation of what it means to be an adult, what it means to be a kind of human in a sense, where we, strive towards our goals, we take responsibility for ourselves, and we basically do things that are good for ourselves. We can take care of ourselves. If you can give me just 2 minutes, because I seem to be having still technical problems. So let me just try to fix it. Okay, I think it's going to work this time. I'm really sorry about it. I don't know, for whatever reason, my internet is freaking out today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through different schemas. There are 4 major schemas in regards to this domain of need for autonomy and performance. The first one is the dependence or feeling incompetent. So basically with this schema, what can happen is that a person might have a certain belief that they cannot survive on their own, that they need other people to take care of themselves. So a classic example here is someone who, is living with their parents over specific time. And I'm not going to set the specific time here or specific age, because everyone is different. Everyone is on their own pathway. But let's say that you have work, you can support yourself financially, you could move out at any point, but you still live with your parents. That's going to kind of interfere with your autonomy and performance. Again, it depends on your circumstances. Maybe you take care of your parents. So I'm not judging here or anything like that. I'm not saying that, everyone has to move out and be on their own at any point. But with the schema of dependence, for example, kind of this being overly attached to our parents or our partners can prevent us from being more autonomous, going out there, getting outside of our comfort zone and striving towards goals that are meaningful to us. Another aspect of the schema of dependence or incompetence is kind of struggling with perhaps making decisions in our life. So we might, lack trust in ourselves, asking constantly for advice, other people, or, searching internet for what is the most appropriate way to live or do things, right? Stuff like that. So lack of trust and feeling like we need other people for helping us to deal with life, for making decisions, for maybe kind of setting even direction for our life. So, it could be simple things like we might struggle to choose our clothes, for example, or we might struggle with things like, setting goals for ourselves in terms of like a career or relationships either. So that's where this dependence can really show up in our lives. And of course, the effect here will be that we'll not be fully kind of separated from the society and other people. We'll not be making our own decisions or our own judgments, but all these kind of decisions and judgments will be saturated by the opinion of other people. So that's the first schema that can kind of impair our need for autonomy and performance, as illustrated in the example, obviously. Now, the next schema relates to vulnerability. So that's how it's called in schema therapy. So in terms of vulnerability, in my opinion, this is a kind of classical anxiety, basically. Classic anxiety where we start worrying about things, that something bad is going to happen to us, that we are really vulnerable to illness or accidents, and of course, feeling like, whatever's the worst out there that can happen, it will happen to us. So obviously with this schema, it's really hard to perform and feel and be autonomous, because we will be avoiding challenges. We will be avoiding situations that could potentially endanger us, right? Because of that catastrophizing and feeling like something bad will happen to us if we do this and that. If I kind of contrast it to like regular judgment, yes, there is danger out there and we need to exercise caution and be responsible and stuff like that. But with this kind of maladaptive schema called vulnerability, it's a little bit excessive. It's usually, it develops because we're kind of overprotected in childhood, where, our parents didn't allow us to get dirty, let's say. So with this vulnerability, we just want to stay in this kind of protective bubble and shield ourselves from various challenges out there in the world. Now, the next schema, the third schema, there are 4 of them in regards to autonomy and performance, is the enmeshment. So with enmeshment, it's kind of similar like with the dependence, but with enmeshment, we simply lack boundaries. We struggle with boundaries in terms of in relationships. So we might feel overly responsible for other people's feelings. we might feel like they cannot function without us, or that our feelings are caused by them, you know, on a regular basis. And there's this kind of merging of yourself with another human being, where the decisions you make are strongly influenced by the other person, and you also get super involved in the decisions of other people. So with this kind of enmeshment, usually this enmeshment, the kind of schema, it comes up in very close relationships. So like with your parents, for example, that's usually where it comes from, or in relationship with significant others, so with your partner, and probably with, in the future, with your children, if you do decide, or if you have any. So in that case, of course, you're not going to be performing well, or not going to be autonomous, because it's like yourself, the core of your being, is kind of spill over other people's selves, basically. So you're not very centered or grounded, but it's all kind of going into different directions, and you're not very grounded within yourself. And the last schema in regards to this domain of needs is failure. So with failure, we believe that we have failed in the past, we are failing right now, and will fail in the future. So it's this kind of constant sense of not being able to succeed, feeling kind of inadequate in comparison to your peers or other people, like there's something wrong with you, and that you cannot succeed, you cannot meet your goals, you're not performing really well. So with failure, it's difficult to achieve anything, because you're going to start believing anytime you're going to, you know, start trying to achieve something, or start meeting your goals, or working towards goals, you're going to start feeling like, okay, that's pointless, I'm not going to work on this because I'm going to fail. So that's the very core of this maladaptive schema. So with all these 4 schemas, I just wanted to give you a kind of broad overview on I'm just double checking because I have some problems today. So with all the schemas, it's a kind of broad overviews, and although they might seem at first like they're kind of different from each other, and of course they're separate, but they all have many different things in common. So the first obvious thing is that all of them appear to be related to this kind of strong sense of self, or rather lack of sense of self. So it's like, whether it's failure or dependence on other people, there is this poor kind of relationship with our values, our priorities. It's always about this kind of expectations in terms of other people. And in all of the schemas, actually, other people are involved a lot. So it's not like we set goals for ourselves and we go and meet them, or, you know, work on things on a day-to-day basis. But it's always kind of involving our other people in our life. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but in terms of the schemas, it's kind of excessive in a sense, where our sense of self depends on what other people are doing or what they are not doing. So whether it's dependence, whether it's enmeshment, it all kind of, at the core of it, is not having this kind of sense of maybe identity or connection with ourselves, or simply not trusting ourselves, not trusting things how they are, but assuming there was. So it's like constantly going outside of ourselves and trying to involve other people in our lives, in a sense, even if it doesn't sound that way, perhaps. Even if it, you know, it might seem like, yeah, but I'm very focused on myself. But the very foundation of the schema seem to be involving other people. Even if the people themselves, they don't enter the picture in a moment. So as I was explaining kind of in the previous videos, and as usual, you're kind of welcome to pause me and ask questions at any point. There's not much discussion going on today, but that's fine. So again, if you want to ask questions, I'm happy to pause and, maybe brainstorm some new ideas. So as I explained in the kind of previous videos, we cope with schemas in different ways. So we have the option for surrender, avoidance, and overcompensation. So with the surrender, that's the simplest option. When that schema gets triggered, so for example, when the dependent schema gets triggered, we feel dependent. We don't question things. We might start feeling, for example, anxious when we have to be a little bit more independent, or we have to make a decision on our own. But we don't really question things. We surrender to the schema. We feel dependent. If I go into the avoidance option, what might happen, for example, with the dependent schema is that we will try to avoid situations that trigger that schema. So we might, usually it manifests like kind of counter dependence, where we go to the opposite end of extreme and try to demonstrate to ourselves and the world that we are super independent. We can completely rely on ourselves. We don't need other people. Other people, there's no help coming, right? So we have this kind of all this kind of coping strategies around avoiding situations where we have to be, or we might need to be dependent on other people in any way. So for example, asking for help can be super uncomfortable. We might start maybe judging like, okay, but I don't really need help from other people, right? Or we might simply avoid situations where we even feel vulnerable in a sense, in a way that requires us to ask for help. What is the opposite of a schema that someone should be aiming for? That's what we're trying to figure out. So basically, we don't want these extreme reactions, but we need to tone things down, basically. And that's what I'm going to get into as well. I'm going to basically go through strategies on how to kind of normalize and work through these schemas. So just to finish, I talked about surrender and avoidance. And in terms of overcompensation, for example, we might, again, either go completely opposite that schema and prove to the tribe, prove to the world how independent we are, or we might kind of how to describe it, kind of bounce between these two extremes. So like we get a bit dependent, but then we start criticizing ourselves, or get anxiety, or get a bit uncomfortable, and we'll then go into counter dependence. So it all kind of depends on the situation. So same happens, of course, in regards to other schemas like vulnerability. We might surrender and completely accept the fact how vulnerable we are, which is, can be a bit excessive at times, and surrounded by this kind of fears and anxiety. We might avoid it. So we might avoid situations that remind us how vulnerable we are, because then that triggers within us that anxiety. Or we overcompensate, and we might, go completely irresponsible and do things that are really bad for us. With enmeshment, again, when we surrender, right? We accept things how they are. Avoidance, we might avoid relationships, we might avoid intimacy in order to prevent us from getting enmeshed with other people. And with overcompensation, we might develop this super strong boundaries, or be super formal and distant from other people. And with failure, again, surrender I don't have to explain, because it's basically as I describe things. Avoidance, we'll avoid challenge, avoid things that trigger within us sense of failure, right? And overcompensation might be a little bit narcissistic at times, where we might be portraying ourselves as super successful in the world, right? So completely invulnerable, not subjected to failure at all, right? Super successful. So with all the schemas, that kind of last question from Baron got me thinking. Like I explained in the previous live stream, it's not like, you have the schema. In a general sense, schemas are not bad, right? But within this context, we're talking about maladaptive schemas. So for example, the schemas that I just described, they are maladaptive because they prevent us from meeting our needs for autonomy and performance. How can you perform if you feel like a failure? How can you be autonomous if you're enmeshed in relationships or you struggle to make decisions on our own? So all these maladaptive schemas come from childhood, where we were either overprotected by our parents, or we didn't get that kind of support to develop our independence, or we were very criticized by our parents, right? So all these little things create these maladaptive schemas where we, for example, enter a certain situation that then triggers our expectation in terms of what's going to happen. These expectations then trigger our interpretation of what is happening. But unfortunately, with the maladaptive schema, the interpretation is not based on what is happening in the reality, but is based on the schema we are having, which is based on our past experiences from childhood. So for Yegor, when and why does a schema become unhealthy rather than just a preference? I think I just explained that. When it's maladaptive, when it prevents us from meeting the need, when the interpretation doesn't meet the reality, right? So for example, if I have a dependent schema and I believe that I'm incompetent as an adult and I cannot take care of myself and I need other people to take care of me, that's a little bit excessive, because I might need help from other people, of course, but it doesn't mean that, I'm somewhat imprisoned or I cannot make decisions because I'm a free adult. So here's the impairment, like it's a kind of limitation in that context. The same in terms of failure, right? I might have failed a few times, but the problem starts where, I cannot do anything else in my life but think about failure, right? I can't take credit of the success. I can't take credit for meeting certain goals because everything is a failure. That's when it becomes maladaptive. AJ, okay, so they are survival mechanisms. Yes, you could call it in a sense survival mechanism, because then you develop a specific coping style. But it's more like basically it's like there are conclusions from your experiences. You could think of it as, you had certain experiences in childhood and you had to explain them to yourself. So what is happening? For example, if your father is highly punitive and criticizes you a lot, you're going to conclude that you are a failure. In most cases, I'm not saying that it's always a case, because maybe some children will be like, no, I don't believe you. Good for them. Like, for most kids, the conclusion will be, okay, I'm a failure and I'm not going to strive towards anything. So it's like this maladaptive schemas could be also considered as a form of basically conclusion or an explanation that you developed for certain things, for certain experiences in your life. Results in distorted perception then, exactly. Yeah. So basically, of course, the goal here is how can we flip the schemas to maybe kind of straighten out our perception. I like this word of distorted perception, or what we can do to kind of untangle ourselves. Because the thing is that you can think of, okay, so you have specific beliefs, maybe, your confidence is lower, or maybe sometimes you feel a little bit maybe needy or dependent in relationships. But the thing is that with the schema, it's the whole pattern of feeling in a particular way as well, and then coping with that feeling. So what happens in a moment when the schema gets triggered is not just, okay, so you interpret the situation in a specific way, just on a cognitive level, but you're also going to start feeling in a specific way, and then you're going to try to cope with this feeling. So it's the whole pattern. And you know, once you, in my opinion at least, from my own experience as well, once you immerse yourself in this emotional experience, let's say anxiety or anger, when you try to be like, you know, counter dependent, once you get into that emotional experience, it's very difficult to kind of step outside of it, unless you of course realize what is happening, right? So that would be one of the solutions. How can we realize that we are within the whole pattern of a schema, right? How can we remind ourselves that, okay, this is my schema triggered right now, okay? I'm in a schema, like my feelings, my emotion, my interpretation, my perception relates to that past experience I have had in the past. So that's something to think about. David asks, are there relations with Jungian archetypes? Are there relations with Jungian archetypes? Maybe, but maybe in some ways. I mean, you could definitely call this kind of patterns as coming from your unconscious. But are they archetypes? Maybe in some ways they could resemble certain archetypes, but I don't think there is exactly a parallel between these two concepts. And the reason for this is because schemas are very, very limited in terms of like behaviors and feelings and perceptions. Like it's very limited point of view. Whereas the archetype, I think, I mean, that's how I understand archetypes. It involves way more than, you know, simple cause and effect. And schemas are very simple. Like once you understand the schemas, they are actually very, very simple. But maybe, I don't know, but what do you think? What do you guys think? Is there a relationship? Can you see a relation between schemas and Jungian archetypes, perhaps? One outsider. So the point is to see every situation as objectively as possible. Yeah, that would be great. That is the whole point. Yes. So kind of straighten your perception, straighten your perspective, straighten your interpretation, and kind of align, you know, what is really happening with what you think is happening. AJ, that's a good point. Joker overcompensation. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, so perhaps there is this kind of mixture of coping styles and coping modes that relate to archetypes. Yeah, that's a really good point. So before I move on to kind of what we can start doing about the schemas, and I'm sorry that I'm not going as deeply into the schemas as I probably should, but there are 18 of them and I have limited time. That's why I kind of broke down all these live streams into 5 domains based on this need, so I can, you know, at least give you a small taste of what the schemas are. But to explore them further, I invite you to, you know, do your own research. There is lots of information online. So before I move into a part of where we try to develop solution and what we can start doing about the schemas, I just wanted to invite you to participate in my group coaching program. I have last spot available, so you can still sign up. And we're going to work on, you know, procrastination, setting goals, achieving goals. So kind of gaining the self-mastery skills, becoming more disciplined. And I think the timing is really right, especially as it's the beginning of the year and we can start maybe working towards developing the year that we want. And also, if you want to work on this related schemas during the coaching program, you are more than welcome, and I will be happy to discuss them more as well. So you can sign up on my website. There is a link in the comment box underneath the video. Okay, So what do we do about the schemas? As I was saying, all of the 5 schemas I discussed today, they seem to have one thing in common, and it's this development of self. So I think the key thing in regards to working with all of these 4 schemas is to get to know yourself better, right? What are your values? What are your priorities? And I think generally kind of sticking to what you really believe, what you really believe to be true, what you really value in your life, right? So it's not just about kind of learning more about yourself, what you like, what you don't like, which is super important too, but kind of sticking to it, especially if it feels like you're going completely against the society or expectations of your family or friends, because very often schemas will keep us in relationships that are not good for us, but they are reinforcing our schemas. So for example, we might get a partner that is super protective of us and we can be dependent on them. Or we can get a partner that, has poor boundaries, for example, right? So when we're in that relationship, we are used to, and they are used to, being kind of enmeshed or dependent on each other, or treating each other or yourself or myself like, we are a failure or something like that. So the schemas can keep us in relationships, not just romantic relationships, but also kind of in terms of social network, and this kind of relationships that reinforce our schemas. So something to question. And I'm not telling you to go and break your relationships or cut people off. So I don't want to be responsible for any of that. But what I'm trying to tell you is to kind of question the dynamics you have with people that you consider close to you. So how do you relate to each other? How does the other person treat you? How do you treat them? Right? What is the dynamic? What is the interaction like? And if you do, start changing your schema, if you do start to work, for example, on becoming more independent or working on your confidence, right? So you want to stop feeling like a failure. Just a little warning that the dynamic with other people might start changing. Other people might not like for you to become more independent or more autonomous. Other people might not like for you to become like more assertive, right? Or start making decisions on your own. So that's something to keep in mind as well as you're working, as you're developing. And it doesn't relate to just the schemas, but any other major change that you're making within your personality or behavior is going to affect other people. So considering that influence and being mindful of it can be helpful too, in terms of not relapsing into older patterns. Something to keep in mind. And when it comes to practical things that we can do, is obviously kind of solitude, spending more time on your own, embracing your own company, right? You don't have to be with people all the time. You don't have to ask for help all the time. But again, I don't discourage it. Like, help is okay, asking for advice is okay, right? It's about kind of questioning how much you are doing it, and reassessing your ability to or need for being autonomous. How are you performing in terms of that independence and being in the world as an adult, as an independent individual? So solitude, journaling, reflection, all these little things can be helpful. But to get even more practical, what they use in schema therapy, and I think it's super helpful too in any kind of context, even if it's just coaching and personal development, is this development of so-called flashcards. So what is a flashcard? A flashcard, it should be flashy, right? The reason for this is obvious. It's to remind us that, for example, we are in a schema, or that we are getting triggered and that we're gonna get into a schema soon, or that we were in a schema in the past. So the point of flashcard is to kind of remind you what is happening, so that you pull yourself out of the pattern, right? And you reassess your interpretation of what is happening. So what sort of things we can include on a flashcard? The first major thing is to describe your experience of what happens when your schema gets triggered. How does it feel like? So for example, you might feel, if for example, if you have a failure schema, you might feel, for example, ashamed when you expose yourself in a sense, or do public speaking, or try to succeed at something, or work on something, right? So what is the experience like? What sort of feelings does it trigger? And you can read more about the schemas online. Again, I'm sorry, I cannot go any deeper than I went in this video. And then the next step, once you describe the schema and what is happening in that moment, when you're in that state, when you're coping with schema, also important to include how you're coping with these feelings, for example, of shame or anxiety. Then describe to yourself what is really happening. So an example here. So right now, my schema of failure has been triggered, and I'm feeling this and this and this, like I'm a failure, I cannot succeed. However, I know that this is my schema that has been triggered, and in reality, I'm an adult, I can make my own decisions, I can succeed, I can, learn new things, learn new skills, and face new challenges. And to make it even more powerful, what you can do is include an evidence of situations when that schema wasn't true. So to use the same example of failure, you could say like, for example, in the past, I succeeded in meeting specific goals, or I was able to learn something new, or, other people praised me, etc., etc. So all this point of a flashcard is to remind you what the schema is like, what does it feel like, what's the situation, how are you going to cope with that situation, what does it lead to, how do you interact with other people in that moment when that schema is on, what sort of feelings. I think feelings, that's a crucial one, because that activates our kind of coping style, coping mechanism. That's where we can start avoiding situations or avoid other people. And then flip it to develop to describe an as accurate interpretation of the situation as you can, as objective. So, key here obviously is to focus on facts. What is really happening in the external world? So it's not about what you think is happening, but what is happening. So I recommend simplicity generally. Focus on, as simple things as possible. If someone, for example, wasn't nice to you, you don't have to make up things like, oh, maybe they have a bad day or something like that, but just say it straight. Okay, they weren't nice to me. And, if you keep observing that, and these people weren't nice to you over, weeks, over 20 interactions, over 30 interactions, yes, there is a pattern. So it's all about kind of developing this meta-awareness, stepping outside of the schemas and patterns that keep you embedded within specific interpretations and emotional experiences. And the more you do it, the more you're stepping outside of it. So at first, it's all going to be happening in the past for you. So you will be looking, using kind of retrospection, where you will be looking at past experiences. So what happened yesterday, what happened a week ago? Oh, that was a schema, right? That was a part of the bigger pattern, let's say. That's how I coped, that's how I felt. But the more you do it, the more you kind of reflect on these past experiences, you're going to start noticing that you can start doing it in the present moment. So I think that's pretty exciting. Like once you get to that point where you can recognize, okay, I'm getting into the schema state, That's where the growth happens, really. Charles asks, is there a schema for being too critical of others? Yes. It's called, if I remember right, punitiveness. But in my opinion, other schemas can also trigger this kind of response. So, as I mentioned, one of the kind of coping styles that we might use when our schema is triggered is overcompensation. So with overcompensation, sometimes what happens is that for whatever reason, we might develop an idea that if we are critical to others, we can start feeling better about ourselves. That's one example. Or we might develop this idea that we have to be perfect, and so other people might need to be perfect too. But I'm gonna get into all this idea of punitiveness and being critical of ourselves and other people when I will be talking about other needs. I think they are about limits or performance or self-efficiency, something like that. But definitely I will get there because it's really important subject. Okay, so are there any more questions? Because I just realized I was talking really fast today. I ran out of things to say. Yes, schemas subconscious / unconscious mind. So they are kind of be outside of our awareness, and because we do them automatically, right? If, for example, let's say you do same thing over and over again since childhood, then yeah, that's gonna be fairly unconscious. It's like, you learned to bicycle one time, you don't have to think about it again. So it's all about breaking the pattern, kind of reflecting on, how you've been interpreting things. So in terms of like kind of past retrospection and past reflections, it all helps to really try to see the bigger picture. So a good example here, although it doesn't have to be entirely related to the schemas I was talking about today, but to kind of illustrate the point how we break the patterns and develop this meta-awareness and get this bigger picture is when we, for example, let's say we have a small argument with someone and we get really angry at them. Maybe we'll throw a plate or something, right? In that moment, it feels like anger is the best thing we can do, right? It's all there is. Only anger exists in that moment, and we have to prove them that they are wrong, that we are right, right? That's a very, very focused, very narrow perception and thus interpretation of what is happening. But once you cool off, once you chill out a little bit, you start to see the bigger picture outside the anger, outside this narrow interpretation. So that's what I want you to do with schemas. When you feel like a failure, where you feel like anxious about making decisions, or you feel like you lack self-trust, explore these feelings, what is outside the boundaries of that moment, of that experience. And it doesn't have to be in the present moment straight away, but just, reflect on past experiences. What happened yesterday, a week ago, or, an hour ago? Why did you feel that way? Where did this feeling come from? And could it be related to schema? And I invite you to again, read more about the schemas, because then understanding them better and kind of signs and symptoms, let's say, will provide you with more clues on how to identify them in real life. Max asks, is dream interpretation part of schema therapy? I'm not sure about I'm not sure about dream interpretation, but since schema therapy, it's a blended approach. It's a blended approach that uses CBT, psychodynamics, so basically psychoanalytical elements and theories, and Gestalt. They do consider the unconscious, obviously, as I was talking in this live stream, like all the schemas are kind of unconscious. But yes, since they're using elements of psychodynamic perspective, they maybe some therapists. I think it might be depending on the therapist, whether they are skilled in dream interpretation. I don't think so in a general sense, but maybe you are lucky, maybe we'll find a person that also does dream interpretation as a part of their therapy. David says, it looks like it is something difficult to do on our own. Yes and no. Yes, having helped therapist or coach or supportive person, someone you trust, super helpful. It accelerates the awareness. But if you're really determined, you work on your mindfulness, you work on developing this meta-awareness, and you stay patient with yourself and pay attention as much as you can, obviously. It's doable. Trust me, it's doable. You just need to, develop a system for something that works for you. It could be journaling, could be, just simple, maybe a routine of going for walks and just simply reflecting, allowing things to come to your awareness and see if you can see patterns. Brad says, isn't it true everyone has schemas, as schemas are more the language for classifying and describing behaviors and beliefs? Yes, in a general sense, yes, we all have schemas. And it's actually really good that we have them, because the schemas make things more efficient. Like, we can interpret things way quicker. But in this live streams, I've been talking about maladaptive schemas. So schemas that are limiting, that are not aligned with the reality, that prevent us from meeting our needs. And in this context, in today's live stream, they prevent us from being more autonomous and performing as good as we can. Max asks, are schemas linked with archetypes, mind mastery? Yeah, we talked about it before, and I'm not entirely sure. Someone suggested there might be a link, for example, between Joker and overcompensation mechanism, which I can see it's happening in certain contexts, but I'm not certain. Personally, I just don't know if there is a link with archetypes. I don't see as much, maybe a little bit, but why would want to identify these schemas and rewire them? What's the expected benefit? Let me ask you this way. Would you just prefer to stay dependent on other people and live with your parents until you are 60? Or, hide in your room and avoid challenges just so you don't feel like a failure? Or would you prefer to be, go out there and feel like, you're a productive adult human being, and that you can achieve things and you can rely on yourself and you can feel safer rather than, scared in your room? That's just one example. I mean, the benefit here is not feeling like you are worthless or that you can't do life as an adult human being. I think, that the benefits here outweigh the potential costs of, putting effort and rewiring maybe certain areas of your brain if necessary even. So, okay guys, so that was fairly productive live stream despite the technical challenges I had on the very beginning. But it was very nice connecting with you. Again, if you do want to explore the schemas, oh, this is interesting, let me stay. What if I'm not bothered by that? Maybe that is the very schema, that you're not bothered by that. But yeah, that's true. If you don't want, then don't work on it. But it's about, that's why it's like someone said before, yeah, oh, like it's difficult, more difficult or challenging to do it on your own. That's why it is helpful to do it with someone else, because someone else can kind of, you know, pinpoint your BS, right? If you're open to it, basically. So pinpoint things when you are, you know, maybe perhaps distorting your perception, distorting what you need, or kind of, you know, bullshitting yourself in a sense, right? So something to consider. But at the same time, I'm not forcing anyone. If you want to keep your schemas, by all means. But my job here and what I'm motivated to do is for you guys to find ways to, you know, expand who you are, basically, and try to meet your needs and become, you know, the best version you can be. And what's the benefit of that? So that you can, you know, remove potential sufferings in the future. So you can deal with the future better, because it's like Jordan Peterson said, it's going to get worse, right? So generally it's best to be prepared, develop as many skills as possible, right? That's why, you know, you constantly heal, you constantly learn more about yourself, you expand your awareness, because other people are doing it. So if you're not doing it, you're staying kind of behind. So that's another thing to consider too. I mean, I know maybe it sounds a little bit harsh, and it's way easier to just stay in your room and not do anything. But something to consider, that, you know, we all have to adapt, we all have to move forward, and we have to survive. I mean, we don't have to, but it would be nice, unless we choose this path of maybe, you know, suffering and potential, you know, sadness and misery from a lack of participation in life, and kind of staying in the same place of maybe anxiety or depression or sadness, or feeling like a failure. So something to consider, something to think about. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Joanna, and I do offer coaching sessions. If you're interested in that, you can sign up on my website. I do offer free 20 minutes consultations, so you can do that if you're not sure whether coaching is right for you. And alternatively, if you do enjoy these live streams, connecting with people, exploring more, you know, different ideas in this kind of group environment, I do offer a group coaching program. You can sign up on my website, and we're going to be working on, you know, developing the self-mastery skills of stopping procrastination, setting goals, achieving goals. So I have one last spot available, so, you know, have a think about it, but it might go pretty soon. Again, thank you so much for connecting with me today, and I'll see you in 2 weeks, same time. Take care of yourself.